All right, welcome back to the class. Today we are going to discuss chapter number 2. Chapter number two's title is The Context of HRM. Now, over the years, I have realized that many of the undergraduate students, especially those who are not native speakers, have a problem with the word context. So, the first thing that I want to make sure everyone understands is the meaning of this very word. Now, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, context is the situation within which something exists or happens and that can help us explain it. So what we are going to actually learn here is more or less we are going to define the framework of HRM and the things that are actually inside this framework, which will help us better understand what actually HRM is really all about. This chapter has 5 objectives. So number 1, we are going to try and understand that HRM actually operates within a broader or a much larger context that most students would normally imagine. Then we are going to try and evaluate the current global and national contexts and their implications or the importance to strategic human resource management. Next thing that we are going to deal with is the changing workforce demographics. Now, probably for many of you who have actually not taken any marketing or management related courses before, this word demographic is actually new to you. Don't worry, as we go along, we are going to discuss the very meaning of demographics and how actually it relates to human resource management. Fourth, we are going to understand the importance of workforce participation. For many of you today, especially the younger generation, this is something probably is difficult for you to imagine, but very briefly, what I have to say is years ago, women were barely part of the labor force. They were housewives and they didn't have any jobs. Now, how this has changed over the years is something that we are going to deal with today. Finally, even though we will skip to a large degree objective number 5, it is all about the legal context of HRM. So some of the laws and regulations that actually have direct relation to the field of human resource management. The first and most important thing that we need to define before we move on with this chapter is the term external environment. Now, most of the undergraduate students have a difficulty in understanding the difference between internal and external environment. Now, the external environment is the environment that is actually outside the organization. That environment usually is divided in a number of categories depending on the course that you study. It may be 4, 5, or even 6. As per this book and in general, with reference to HRM, we usually look at 6 different factors or categories. Now, this slide gives you a brief overview of what these 6 categories are. So starting with economic factors, so these are all the factors related to the economy, for instance, gross domestic product, annual income, inflation, and so forth. Next is the so-called natural or environmental factors. Now, when you think of natural factors, think of nature, think of earthquakes, think of floods, all these aspects of the nature that actually can have an influence on our company. Third, is the technological factors. These are actually very important factors nowadays. As you have probably seen over the last 20 or so years, technological development has made a substantial leap forward, and this, of course, has had a great impact on the way companies do business today. Next is the political factor. These are also very important factors, as we will find out. Of course, we have the cultural factors. Cultural factors are very important, especially for companies doing business on an international basis. And finally, it's the so-called demographics. So demographics, as you'll find out, is the study of population. So when it comes to demographics, what we are really concerned with is the population. For instance, the overall number of the population inside the country, the age distribution, birth rate, mortality rate, and so forth. So all these six aspects of the so-called external, or also known as macro environment, have actually an impact on human resource management. Now, as we have already defined the external factors, the next thing that we are going to discuss is globalization. Now, for anyone who actually is majoring in international business and management, the term globalization is something that you have probably heard or read over and over again. It is, however, important that once again we make sure that we understand what globalization actually is. So there are, of course, way too many definitions of globalization. I've picked only two of them from two different books. One of them is on human resource management. This is the first one right here. And then the second definition comes from a book on management. Now, according to the HRM book, globalization can be described as the increased pace of economic and cultural interconnectedness between different countries. So what interconnectedness means is actually that countries are connected. So that's the whole idea. So many years ago, if you look back at the history of your own country, you will realize that certain products or certain businesses were only found inside your country. Later on, as globalization expanded, some of these products were also offered in other parts of the world. If we take Vietnam, for instance, Vietnam is famous for this noodle soup called pho. And if many years ago you wanted to have pho, the only way you could have that is to go all the way to Vietnam. Now today, regardless of whether you are Vietnam or in any other part of the world, there are shops or restaurants where you can actually have Vietnamese pho. Now, this is a very simple example of what globalization has done to the world and to our lives. Another description, which is very similar, is the following. Globalization is the interdependence of countries. So as countries become more connected or interconnected, they actually become more dependent. So while globalization is good on one side, it can also have some negative features. For instance, the financial crisis, or the GFC, the global financial crisis that started in the United States in 2008, was not relevant to the United States only, but actually it had an impact throughout the entire world. So globalization, in fact, can be the interdependence of countries. That is, what happens in one country can actually impact other countries, and this can be either good or bad. now that we have defined already what globalization is, the next thing that we would like to discuss is the so-called global economic context. In your books, right after the introduction section, actually, there is a whole section of about 5 pages where you can find more information about these 6 developments that happened within the last 30 to 40 years. Now, the Global Economic Context section talks about the impact of the most recent global financial crisis on human resource management, the formation of the European Union, the restructuring of the People's Republic of China, also known as PRC, and of course Vietnam. These are 2 of the biggest socialist republics or countries in the world. Then the next thing, the resumption of Hong Kong and Macau, is very much related to the restructuring of People's Republic of China. The book also talks about another financial crisis, which was about 11 years before the global financial crisis, and is also known as the Asian financial crisis. Finally, there is some text about various economic unions, such as the APEC and the ASEAN, very important unions, especially to those students who come from the East Asia or the Asia Pacific region. Now, for this particular video, I will take a look at the impact of the recent global financial crisis on HRM, as well as the restructuring of the People's Republic of China and Vietnam. Alright, so let's now talk a little bit about the global financial crisis and its impact on human resource management. First of all, as usual, I have included a video. This is the URL of the video, which actually explains the global financial crisis in a rather simple and very entertaining way. So before you actually continue with this video, I suggest you copy this URL and paste it into your web browser and spend the next 4 to 5 minutes actually watching this self-explanatory video. In short, I have tried to summarize what the global financial crisis is all about. So it started with the collapse of the American housing market. So in very short, since year 2000, banks in the United States were giving loans to people who were interested in buying houses. Unfortunately, these banks didn't really pay enough attention as to whether the borrowers, the people who needed the money, were able to pay back. So at one point in time, around year 2007, end of 2007, beginning of 2008, it became clear that many of the borrowers were actually unable to pay the interest rates as well as their loans. So this led to a domino effect where many financial institutions went bankrupt. Probably the biggest one of them was the Lehman Brothers, which is why this financial crisis is also known as the Lehman Brothers shock. And once a number of banks went bankrupt, of course, you can imagine the American economy went into crisis. This crisis, however, expanded outside the United States and affected the European Union members, as well as other developed and developing countries around the world. Now, important to human resource management, these, of course, are basic economics concepts. Whenever you have a financial or economic crisis, usually companies start to lose business, which immediately means that you need to decrease the number of employees you have. So that's why one of the impacts of the global financial crisis was the reduced demand for labor, which means, in simple English, Companies needed fewer workers in order to actually do their business. Also, because of the crisis and the decrease in profits, it was very important for companies to actually save on costs. And what you will find out as part of this book is that the biggest cost of every company actually is related to the personnel. So those are the salaries, the benefits, and so forth. So after the global financial crisis started, many companies were forced to decrease the salaries as well as the benefits of their employees. Now, number three very much relates to number one. So once you decrease the number of employees, many a times what you have to actually do is you need to put one or two or even more people into a position where they will be performing not just their regular day-to-day job responsibilities, but other job responsibilities that used to be part of people who now are not part of the company. So it means that if you were, let's say you were hired as a marketing specialist and you were only busy with marketing, it may as well happen during and after 2008 that you need to do things that are actually outside the field of marketing. For instance, sales or even HRM. So for a marketing specialist to be able to do something that's not part of his job description, and especially that's not part of what he studied in the past or what he specialized in, then you need additional training and development. These three developments regarding the impact of the global financial crisis on HRM are of course not the only ones. There were other similar developments as well, but this is just to show you how actually a financial crisis can affect human resource management. Okay, so next we want to discuss the restructuring of two socialist economies, People's Republic of China, which is the biggest social economy and the second largest world economy after the United States and present. The next economy that we want to discuss, and is particularly important to you, is the Vietnamese economy and the restructuring that started in 1986. Now, this is a completely separate topic that you would usually discuss throughout your principles of management course, but very briefly. So you very well know that China and Vietnam are socialist countries. They are different from most other countries around the world, not only in terms of their political but also economic system. First of all, you have only one party, which is the Communist or the Socialist Party. Many years ago, unlike now, there was no private ownership. So this means is that people did not have their own businesses just like they have now. Everything was owned by the state or the country. Moreover, up until the end of the 1980s, there was a very limited collaboration with the West. And by the West, we're talking about Western Europe, of course, the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of the developed economies. Now, since the restructuring, which started around the end of last century, these two economies from socialist have become some sort of hybrid economies. So what does that really mean? A hybrid economy is an economy that actually has some socialism, some aspects that are particularly socialist based, and also some aspects that are capitalist based. What do we mean by this? The one party political system is still in place. At the same time, however, since the restructuring, now we have private ownership. As you see, so many places around Vietnam. You have these little tiny shops and bigger ones, restaurants, cafes. All these establishments are not owned by the so-called state, but are privately owned. Along with that, these two countries opened up to the rest of the world, and now there is a lot of foreign direct investment. This is what FDI stands for, foreign direct investment, particularly from the West as well as East Asia, such as Japan and South Korea, very prominent investors here in Vietnam. There are also other aspects such as fluctuating local currency, but this isn't a course on finance and accounting or economics. So as long as you understand the difference between a socialist and capitalist economy and this restructuring that took place during the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, then we are fine. Actually, for those of you who are very interested in the restructuring of Vietnam, there is a very interesting video that I found out online. This is the link to it, so please feel free actually to have a look. And I'm pretty sure that you actually learn a lot of things that you may have not heard before. What I want you to remember as well is that except for the restructuring that we just talked about in China as well as Vietnam, overall there have been some changes in the industry structures. What do we mean by this is if we look at the GDP composition, usually it contains three main categories: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So these three components actually describe the so-called gross domestic product composition. Now, what you will realize is if you look at the timeline, so you go back in time, say 300-400 years ago, agriculture used to be the most important aspect of the gross domestic product. Manufacturing was very little. Now, if you remember, going back to chapter number 1, we said there was an agricultural revolution before the industrial revolution. So once again, during the agricultural revolution, most people working were actually busy growing different types of vegetables, fruits, and so on. Now, later on, as we already know, at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, we had the so-called Industrial Revolution where manufacturing picked up and it became later on the most important component of the gross domestic product. What is, however, interesting today is if you look at the most developed economies, for instance, America, Germany, Canada, France, Italy, and so on and so on, you will realize that in terms of the gross domestic product composition, services sector is the most prominent or the most important one. These three different sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, and services, require different skills. What I mean by this is if you are working as a farmer, you need one set of skills in order to be a good farmer. Once you move to manufacturing, you need a different set of skills in order to be successful as part of the manufacturing process. If, however, you are working within the services sector, then you need completely different skills. And this, of course, is very important to the field of HRM. Now, in this slide, what I've tried to actually present or show to you is the importance of agriculture throughout the last 20 to 25 years. This is on a world basis. It means this is for the entire world. So as you can see, In 1994, the percentage of the GDP that was actually brought by agriculture was almost 8.5%. Now, in 2016, the GDP percentage as for, the percentage of agriculture as part of GDP stood at only 3.5%. So what we see here is actually the importance of agriculture as part of the gross domestic product is decreasing throughout the world. Why is this? Now we talk about Industry 3.0, Industry 4.0. This actually represent more or less the technological developments that have been taking place throughout the last 30 or 40 years. So fewer people are actually employed in the agricultural sector. Many who used to be farmers now are either working somewhere in manufacturing or in services sector. This is actually very briefly discussed within the book, and chapter number 2 in particular. As I've already said, the book that we are using for this course is mainly based on the case of Australia. Australia, just like most other developed economies, went through the same industry structural changes. Decline in agriculture we've also seen in Australia, and interesting, for instance, since the 1970s, there has been a rise of the services sector. So what does that mean is actually the services sector is now actually much more important in the agricultural sector or even the manufacturing sector. This, as I said, is more or less represented by the shift in industries from manufacturing. Now we are moving to, we've already moved to Industry 3.0, and now we are moving to Industry 4.0. To understand the difference between these three categories that actually represent the total GDP, I have created this table which looks at three different economies. Laos, which is an underdeveloped economy, Vietnam, which is a developing economy, and Germany, which is a developed economy. So we have the three sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And what you can see actually is the more underdeveloped the countries, the more important the agricultural sector is as part of the GDP is. So for instance, in the case of Laos, in 2019, almost 21% of the GDP was generated by the agricultural sector. In comparison, Vietnam's agricultural sector generated less than 10%, and in Germany, look here, less than 1% of the entire GDP is generated by agriculture. So the most developed economies are actually focusing on services. Manufacturing is still important, but the services sector now is the most important sector in the world if we look at the some data that refers to the global economy as a whole. So what you can expect in the future actually is that Laos, if it continues to develop, will sooner or later end up looking like Germany, and the same is valid for Vietnam. Actually, very soon, probably in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe. I'm saying maybe, we are not really sure, but soon enough, services sector in Vietnam will be the most important sector as part of the GDP. As you can see, the manufacturing sector generates about 49% of the GDP as of now, and the services sector about 41.5%. These numbers are not very far apart from one another, and soon as I said, the services sector will actually overtake manufacturing in terms of GDP generation. The next topic that we need to discuss, and actually and it's an extremely important topic, is the topic of demographics. Now, for year 3 students, especially those of you who have already taken some marketing related courses, the topic of demographics is topic that they have probably covered in the past and they understand to some extent. For all other students who are either grade 1 or year 1 or year 2, demographics is probably a new topic, but if you are going to major in HRM, this is an extremely important topic. Just like human resource management deals with people in a simple sense, so is the case of demographics. Now, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, demographics deals with the number and characteristics of people who live in a particular area or form a particular group. In very simple English, demographics is the study of population. Why is demographics important to the human resource management field? Is again because it deals with people just like HRM does.